Between the 12th and the 21st of August, 1944, the 1st Canadian Army drove south from Caen into a pocket of ground near the Norman town of Falaise, and helped seal somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 German soldiers inside a shrinking ring they could not break. This is the story of how the Canadian Army closed the northern jaw of the Falaise Pocket, what that closure cost, and why historians have argued about it for more than 80 years. Start at the end, because the end is the argument. On the 22nd of August, 1944, Army Group B filed a report stating that the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend consisted of 10 tanks, 300 men, and no artillery at all. 2.5 months earlier, on the 6th of June, that same division had fielded 20,540 men, 229 tanks and assault guns, 658 armored vehicles, and roughly 2,000 soft-skinned vehicles. 10 weeks reduced a full-strength armored formation to a company's worth of survivors with 10 tanks and nothing left to shoot with. That was the German formation standing directly in front of the Canadians on the Caen to Falaise road, and it deserves to be named plainly. Not a scratch unit thrown together from stragglers, and not a broken remnant when the fighting started, but the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, holding the exact ground the Canadian Army had to cross. The Falaise Pocket, which the Germans called the Kessel von Falaise, the Falaise Cauldron, closed out the Battle of Normandy. Allied forces encircled German Army Group B, meaning the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, formerly Panzergruppe West, in the country around Falaise in the department of Calvados. The battle wrecked most of Army Group B west of the Seine and opened the road to Paris. The northern jaw of that encirclement belonged to 1st Canadian Army and to the 2nd Canadian Corps, and it had to swing down from Caen through the most heavily defended ground in Normandy. The southern jaw belonged to the United States 3rd Army driving up from Argentan, while the British formed the base of the trap. On the evening of the 21st of August, 1944, the pocket closed. What follows covers the 9 days before that evening, and the 80 years of argument that came afterward. To understand what the Canadians were sent to do in August, you first have to understand what had already happened in Normandy across the month of July. The strategic sequence ran like this. Operation Goodwood opened on the 18th of July. Operation Cobra, the American First Army breakout under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, followed on the 25th of July. Operation Bluecoat, the British attack, began on the 30th of July. And on the 7th of August, 1944, the Germans counterattacked at Mortain in an operation they codenamed Luttich. Those 4 operations produced a specific shape on the map, and that shape is the whole point. Cobra tore the German line open in the American sector and let Allied armor flow west, then south, then east. Bluecoat kept the pressure on further north. Operation Luttich pushed German armor further west still, deeper into a salient that was already being outflanked on both sides. Look at what the German command committed to Luttich, because the arithmetic is grim. 4 depleted panzer divisions went in, including the 2nd Panzer Division, the SS Leibstandard, and the SS Das Reich, and between them they mustered roughly 75 Panzer IVs, 70 Panthers, and 32 self-propelled guns. That was the striking power thrown at the hinge of the American breakout, and it represented most of what the Germans had left in Normandy that could still maneuver. The attack collapsed inside about 24 hours, because the Allies had been forewarned by ultra-intercepts, the decryption of German signals traffic, and the counterattack was blunted almost immediately. The moment Lieutenant General Omar Bradley grasped what the Germans had just done to themselves, he said so, and his words were recorded by the historian Chester Wilmot. Bradley called it an opportunity that comes to a commander not more than once in a century, and he said they were about to destroy an entire hostile army and go all the way from there to the German border. Hold that against everything that follows, because Bradley set the standard himself. Not damage an army. Not push an army back across the Seine. Destroy an entire hostile army. 9 days later, on the 13th of August, 1944, the same commander halted the southern jaw of the trap at Argentan. 39 years after that, in a memoir published in 1983, Bradley conceded that the halt led up to 50,000 veteran German troops out of the trap. The distance between those two statements, the opportunity of a century in early August and the admission of 50,000 escapees written down decades later, is the space where the entire argument about the Falaise Pocket lives. The failure of Luttich mattered less than its geometry. Every panzer division driving west at Mortain was a panzer division driving further into the mouth of a bag that was closing behind it, and the German command had spent its remaining mobile reserve pushing in precisely the wrong direction. Here is an analogy, offered strictly as an analogy and not as a historical claim. Modern systems engineering describes something called a commitment trap, the point at which an organization has invested so heavily in a plan that reversing costs more than continuing, even when continuing is measurably worse, and every additional resource committed makes withdrawal harder rather than easier. Operation Luttich worked the same way for German Army Group B, because the armor committed west at Mortain on the 7th of August could not be extracted east through Falaise on the 16th. The analogy stops there, since no historian is claiming the German staff ran a modern decision model, but the shape of the error is recognizable. Montgomery ordered the armies to converge on the Falaise and Chambois area on the 8th of August, 1944. By that date the German mobile forces were committed in the wrong direction, American armor ran loose in the German rear, and the only question left was how fast the jaws could close. Command structure matters here more than it usually does, because the central controversy of the Falaise Pocket is a controversy about command boundaries. At the top of the ground campaign sat 21st Army Group under General Bernard Montgomery, the Allied Ground Forces commander. Beneath 21st Army Group sat 1st Canadian Army under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, alongside the United States 12th Army Group under Lieutenant General Omar Bradley. 1st Canadian Army became operational on the 23rd of July, 1944, and that date deserves to be read in context. Activation came on the 23rd of July, Operation Spring launched on the 25th of July, and Operation Totalize launched on the night of the 7th of August. The Canadian Army headquarters that ran the northern jaw of the Falaise encirclement was less than 3 weeks old when the encirclement began. 1st Canadian Army comprised the 2nd Canadian Corps under Lieutenant General Guy Simons, the 1st British Corps, the attached 1st Polish Armored Division, and the 51st Highland Division. General histories lose this detail constantly, and it matters, because 1st Canadian Army was never exclusively Canadian. It functioned as a multinational army under Canadian command, and its most important attached formation, the 1st Polish Armored Division under Major General Stanisław Maxek, would end up fighting the most desperate action of the entire encirclement. The southern jaw belonged to the United States 3rd Army under Lieutenant General George Patton, driving north toward Argenton. Now the strategic choice, because there were two ways to trap Army Group B. The short hook meant a tight envelopment closing at Argenton and Falaise. The long hook meant a wider envelopment running east to the River Seine, cutting the German escape at the river crossings. Allied command chose the short hook, and that decision seated nearly every argument about Falaise published since. Choose the short hook and the trap closes faster, but it closes on ground the Germans are actively defending with their strongest remaining formations. Choose the long hook and the net catches everything, but the Germans get more time and more road. The short hook won, and the Canadians drew the ground where the 12th SS Panzer Division was standing. Before Totalize, before Tractable, before Falaise itself, there was the 25th of July, 1944, and a piece of high ground called Verrières Ridge. Operation Spring ran concurrently with the American Cobra breakout, and its purpose was to press south from cannon-pin German armor in the eastern sector so it could not redeploy west against the Americans. Judged by that standard alone, Verrières helped Cobra, because it did pin German panzer formations, and that is a real case for the operation. Judged by every other standard, the 25th of July was a catastrophe. The Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, suffered the costliest single day for a Canadian battalion since Dieppe. Their start line was never secured, senior officers went down early, and Major Frederick Philip Griffin took command of an attack that was already coming apart before it began. The numbers require precision rather than confidence, and the Black Watch losses are disputed. One figure widely repeated in general reference sources gives 315 casualties out of roughly 325 men, counting killed, wounded, and captured. A different figure, drawn from official records and cited by Valor Canada, gives 307 casualties across 4 days rather than one morning. Those are not the same claim, because one describes a battalion annihilated in a morning and the other describes very heavy losses spread across a period, and both figures circulate freely. This account presents both with attribution rather than picking the more dramatic one. The historian David O'Keefe, writing for the National World War II Museum, states that the two lead divisions lost approximately 1,500 men, 500 of them dead, in a single morning. Operation Spring as a whole produced roughly 1,500 Canadian casualties on the 25th of July, while the wider Battle of Verrières Ridge, measured across its full duration, produced roughly 2,800 according to the historian Mark Zulka. 1,500 casualties in one morning, on one ridge, foreground measured in hundreds of meters. The Canadian formations asked to break through toward Falaise 2 weeks later were those same formations, refilled with reinforcements, and they had just learned on Verrières Ridge exactly what a prepared German anti-tank defense does to infantry crossing open wheat. That experience shaped everything Guy Simons planned next, because Verrières had proved that a conventional daylight infantry attack down the Caen to Falaise corridor would be destroyed. Simons responded by refusing to attack conventionally at all. On the 31st of July, 1944, Brigadier G.M. Grant received an instruction from Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, telling him to convert 72 M7 Priest self-propelled guns into armored personnel carriers by the 9th of August. The deadline then moved forward to the 6th of August. This is one of the most consequential pieces of improvised engineering in the Canadian Army's war, and general histories routinely compress it into a single sentence, so here is the detail. The M7 Priest carried a 105mm howitzer mounted in an open-topped hull on a Sherman-derived chassis. Conversion stripped out the howitzer and the ammunition bins, then welded armor plate over the gun aperture, and what remained was a tracked armored box that could carry infantry forward at the same speed as tanks, under armor, through artillery fire. Soldiers called them defrocked priests, or unfrocked priests. The workshop detachment that built them carried the codename Kangaroo, and the name transferred to the vehicles themselves. The Advanced Workshop Detachment operated under Major George A. Wigan of the Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps, the officer commanding the 2nd Tank Troops Workshop, Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Roughly 250 men were pulled in from some 14 separate workshops, drawing on the Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, the Royal Canadian Ordnance Corps, the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, and British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers units, and that figure comes from the regimental history of the Perth Regiment. Major Gil Pointer receives credit for suggesting the name Kangaroo, drawing on the image of infantry carried forward protected, as he put it, in Mommy's pouch. Completion of the prototype came on the 3rd of August, 1944, and it was driven to 2nd Canadian Corps headquarters for Guy Simons to inspect by an officer of the 25th Canadian Armoured Delivery Regiment, the Elgin Regiment. By the morning of the 6th of August, 1944, 76 priests had been converted. 76 vehicles, 6 days, 14 workshops, 250 men. Another analogy, again strictly an analogy. Modern hardware manufacturing describes something called a rapid retooling sprint, which pulls engineers from multiple product lines into a single temporary unit to build a physical prototype and reach production inside a compressed deadline, bypassing the normal procurement cycle entirely. The Kangaroo conversion followed that pattern in Normandy in 1944 with welding torches and captured workshop space. Nobody in that workshop was reading a manufacturing methodology, and the comparison holds only as a structural parallel, but the shape of what those men did, with cross-functional teams, a prototype in 3 days, production in 6, and deployment on the 7th, is the shape modern hardware organizations spend enormous effort trying to reproduce. The performance figures are worth holding on to. Of the 76 Priest Kangaroos, 61 still counted as battle-worthy at the end of Operation Tractable, with 15 recoverable casualties, most of them mechanical rather than combat losses. The 1st Canadian Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron, known as the Kangaroo Squadron, formed as a permanent unit around the 20th to 28th of August, 1944. The Canadian Army had invented the armoured personnel carrier in a field workshop, under a 6-day deadline, because Verrières Ridge had proved that infantry could not walk to Falaise. Operation Totalize rested on a single insight, which was that the German anti-tank defense on the Caen to Falaise road could not be beaten in daylight, so it would be attacked at night. That sounds simple, and it was not. Moving armored columns cross-country in darkness, in formation, on a compass bearing, through choking dust, ranks among the hardest things a mechanized army can attempt, and Guy Simons built a navigation system to make it possible. 4 components made up that system. Artificial moonlight came first, with searchlights aimed at clouds so the beams reflected downward and spread diffuse illumination across the battlefield, and the technique carried a formal name, movement light. Bofors anti-aircraft guns fired tracer on fixed lines as directional markers, giving the columns a visible bearing to follow. Radio directional beams supplied an electronic reference. Artillery fired marker shells to designated points to indicate progress and boundaries. For independent navigation aids, layered on top of each other, and they were not enough. Many units still got lost in the dust and darkness, and that fact will matter enormously 2 nights later on a hill designated Point 140. The assault itself was built around the kangaroos. 6 assault columns of armor and infantry went forward, with the infantry riding inside the converted priests, advancing behind a rolling barrage fired by 720 artillery pieces. 720 guns represents the weight of metal moving ahead of the Canadian and British columns on the night of the 7th of August, 1944. Royal Air Force Bomber Command opened its bombardment at 2300 hours, and the armored columns crossed the start line at 2330. By dawn on the 8th of August, the villages of Cramesnil, Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil, Garcelles-Sequeville, and Tilly-la-Campagne had all fallen. The night phase of Operation Totalize worked. Canadian and British columns punched through the forward German defensive belt in darkness, riding in armored personnel carriers that had not existed 9 days earlier, navigating by searchlight glare and anti-aircraft tracer. The men doing this deserve to be named, because general accounts compress the Canadian regiments of the Cannes to Falaise drive into the single phrase Canadian infantry. Formations of 2nd Canadian Corps engaged across this period included the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, and the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. Among the infantry regiments were the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment of Canada, together with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Calgary Highlanders, the South Saskatchewan Regiment, the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, the Fusiliers Mont Royal, the Algonquin Regiment, and the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada. The armoured regiments included the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, which was the 27th Armoured Regiment, the British Columbia Regiment, which was the 28th Armoured Regiment, the South Alberta Regiment, which was the 29th Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment, and the Canadian Grenadier Guards. Attached and fighting alongside them were the 51st Highland Division and the 1st Polish Armoured Division, while Brigadier Eric Booth commanded the 4th Canadian Armoured Brigade. Those units carried the northern jaw of the Falaise encirclement, and every casualty figure in this account comes out of that list. Then the sun came up. Daylight brought heavy bomber support from the United States 8th Air Force, and around midday on the 8th of August, 1944, that bombardment fell on Allied positions. Aircraft of the 8th Air Force struck the headquarters of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and the headquarters of the 1st Polish Armoured Division, killing approximately 65 Allied soldiers and wounding approximately 250. Some accounts specify 25 Poles among the dead. That was the first of 2 friendly fire bombing incidents absorbed by Canadian and Polish troops on the drive to Falaise, and a second, worse one arrived on the 14th of August, delivered by a different air force for an entirely different reason. Casualties were not the only consequence, because momentum suffered too. The daylight phase of Totalize slowed, and the slowing handed the German defense, principally the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend with its 88mm anti-tank guns, the hours it needed to re-establish a line further south around Cannes Wood. Casualty accounting for Totalize as a whole is genuinely contested, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. One widely circulated figure gives at least 1,256 Allied casualties. A separate source, History of War, cites 44 dead and 121 wounded for one specific brief engagement inside the operation, which measures a much smaller action. German losses across Totalize are given at roughly 3,000, while tank losses are given as roughly 45 German against 146 or more Allied, according to D-Day Overlord. Every one of those figures needs checking against C.P. Stacy's official history, the Victory Campaign, before anyone treats them as settled, and they appear here as a range with attribution, which is the honest form. The 8th of August is not remembered mainly for the short bombing, though. It is remembered for what happened in a field near Gomsnil at roughly 12:40 in the afternoon. At approximately 12:40 on the 8th of August, 1944, near Gomsnil and Saint-Aignan-Cramesnil, a Tiger tank carrying the turret number 007 was destroyed by a hit that detonated its ammunition and blew the turret clean off the hull. Inside sat SS Standartenführer Michael Wittmann, the most publicized tank commander in the German armed forces, along with his crew. Who killed him has been argued over for 40 years, and the argument has never been settled. Here are the claims, all of them, with the named historians attached. The long-accepted answer credits Trooper Joe Ekins, a gunner in a Sherman Firefly of a squadron, 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry. The Northamptonshire Yeomanry War Diary records 3 Tiger turret numbers knocked out, being 312, 007, and 314, and 007 belonged to Whitman. Engagement range ran roughly 1,000 to 1,200 meters. Les Taylor advanced this case in after the battle in 1985, the veteran historian Ken Tout supported it, and Stephen Ashley Hart backs it as well. The Canadian claim arrived more recently and rests on field study of the ground itself. Recent analysis places Shermans of a squadron, 27th Canadian Armoured Regiment, the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, at under 150 yards, firing from behind the chateau wall at Gomsnell. Analysis published by Key Military concludes that Shermans of a squadron, 27th Canadian Armoured Regiment destroyed Whitman's Tiger along with the trailing tank, while still crediting Joe Ekins with the 3 Tigers visible from the orchard. Other claims have been examined and discarded. Brian A. Reed devotes a dedicated appendix in his book No Holding Back to testing them, covering the 1st Polish Armoured Division claim, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division claim, the 144th Regiment Royal Armoured Corps claim, and the Royal Air Force Typhoon rocket attack claim. That Typhoon claim deserves specific attention, because the general public repeats it more often than any of the others. It rests largely on the testimony of Serge Varin, the French civilian who took the only known photograph of the destroyed Tiger and who reported an unexploded rocket lying near the wreck. Reed dismisses the air claim on 2 grounds, being that Royal Air Force operational logs make no claim of engaging tanks at that location, and that Whitman's own surviving crews reported no air attack at all. Here is where the record contradicts the legend directly. Nazi propaganda claimed that Whitman fell to the dreaded fighter bombers, and Royal Air Force logs and his own unit both contradicted that claim. Put plainly, the version of Whitman's death that circulated most widely was manufactured, and it was manufactured by the side he fought for, because being killed by an anonymous aircraft made a more useful story than being killed by a Sherman crew in a hedgerow at close range. The honest position holds that the killing shot remains disputed between the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry and the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, and that the Typhoon story is discredited. Anyone telling you flatly that one gunner killed Michael Whitman is telling you something the evidence does not support. The names worth keeping for the record are Brian A. Reed, Les Taylor, Ken Tout, Stephen Ashley Hart, Henri Marie, and Serge Varin. On the 9th of August, 1944, a Canadian battle group received orders to seize high ground designated Point 195, and it never reached Point 195. That battle group was built around the 28th Canadian Armoured Regiment, the British Columbia Regiment, with approximately 52 tanks, plus B Company, C Company, and Headquarters Company of the Algonquin Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Worthington commanded it, and history remembers it by his name, as Worthington Force. Moving in darkness after skirting Halpenny Force at Bretteville-le-Rabbit, the battle group lost direction. Remember the navigation problem from Toddelize, with artificial moonlight, Beaufort's tracer, radio beams, and marker shells, and units getting lost in dust and darkness anyway. Worthington Force went astray by approximately 6.5 kilometers. It halted on Point 140, also identified as Hill 111, in the belief that it had reached Point 195. Point 140 sat east of the objective and behind the newly re-established German line. Isolated, in the open, in daylight, inside the operational area of Kampfgruppe 1 of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the battle group was destroyed, and Lieutenant Colonel Donald Worthington was killed. Casualty figures for the action are disputed, and the reason for the dispute teaches something rather than merely frustrating. Project 44 and the historian Michael Bechtold give 240 casualties, breaking down as 85 killed, 121 wounded, and 34 captured, along with 47 tanks lost. A general reference entry for the battle for Hill 140 gives 232 men and 47 tanks. The British Columbia Regiment's own service record gives 155 members of the regiment who died on or after the 9th of August. And the memorial plaque standing on the ground states that 112 soldiers perished. For numbers, and the spread reflects definition rather than carelessness. The regimental figure counts only members of the British Columbia Regiment and excludes the attached Algonquin Regiment infantry, while the battle group figure counts everyone. Died of wounds cases attributed to later dates move between categories depending on the cutoff used, and the memorial figure counts the dead on the position itself. One further fact about Worthington Force tends to get buried by the tragedy. German attention concentrated against the isolated battle group on point 140, drawing armor away from point 195, and that contributed to the capture of Hill 195 the following day. A battle group was destroyed on the wrong hill, and its destruction helped take the right one. That offers no consolation, and it is simply what the record shows. On the 13th of August, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley halted Lieutenant General George Patton's 15th Corps just south of Argenton, and the southern jaw stopped moving. This ranks as the most argued over decision of the entire Normandy campaign, and it sits underneath every accusation that the Canadians moved too slowly, because if the southern jaw had kept moving, the northern jaw's pace would be a footnote instead of an indictment. Bradley gave two reasons. Prearranged army group boundaries came first. Fear of a head-on collision, meaning fratricide between American forces driving north and Canadian forces driving south with no reliable means of identifying each other in a fluid battle, came second. Overextension of American forces worried him as well. A contemporary rumor held that the halt was caused by airdropped time bombs sown on the roads between Argenton and Falaise, and Martin Blumenson notes that rumor in the United States Army official history. The deeper dispute concerns whose order it actually was, and that one remains live. The United States Army official history, meaning Martin Blumenson's breakout and pursuit, Chapter 26, frames Bradley as the decision-maker, and most viewers will have encountered that standard account. Richard Romer, writing in Patton's Gap, argues that the order originated with Montgomery. Romer's evidence includes Forrest Pogue's 1947 interview with Brigadier E. T. Williams, in which Williams recalled Montgomery saying to tell Bradley they ought to get back. It includes the Strafford Diary, which records Bradley as having been instructed by the Commander-in-Chief of 21st Army Group to halt on the inter-army group boundary. It includes the Chester Hansen Diary, and it includes Carlo d'Este's decision in Normandy, at page 441. That amounts to a real evidentiary case. It remains unresolved, and this account presents it as unresolved. What nobody disputes is what Bradley himself eventually wrote. In A General's Life, published in 1983 with Clay Blair, Omar Bradley acknowledged that the failure at Argenton allowed up to 50,000 veteran German troops to escape, cadres that would be refitted and would fight again in the Ardennes. 50,000 men, acknowledged by the commander who gave the halt order, in his own memoir, 39 years later. Hold that figure, because it sits directly against every claim that the gap stayed open because Canadian formations moved too slowly. Operation Totalise had stalled by the 10th and 11th of August, 1944, and Guy Simons immediately began planning the follow-up. Operation Tractable, launched on the 14th of August, inverted the Totalise concept. Where Totalise had attacked at night, concealed by darkness, Tractable would attack in daylight, concealed by smoke. The logic ran straight. German defenders had learned to expect night attacks and had re-established their anti-tank screens to match, so a daylight advance behind a rolling artillery smoke screen offered the same concealment with none of the navigation chaos that had cost Worthington Force an entire battle group 5 days earlier. Columns could see each other, and German gunners could not see them. The assault opened with medium bombers of No. 2 Group, 2nd Tactical Air Force, followed by heavy bombers of Royal Air Force Bomber Command. That was the plan, and here is what happened to the plan. On the night before the attack, an officer of the 8th Canadian Reconnaissance Regiment, the 14th Canadian Hussars, was killed while carrying the Operation Tractable plan forward. German troops recovered the document, and it reached Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Meyer used it, repositioning his armor and his 88mm anti-tank guns before the attack went in. Now the honest part, because this is exactly the sort of detail that gets inflated into a decisive turning point in most retellings. The impact of the captured plan is disputed. The military history site Historia4 states that the capture had little impact on the outcome, while D-Day Overlord and the Map Archive treat it as important. Both readings hold up against the available evidence, and settling them by assertion would be dishonest. What can be stated with confidence is that Kurt Meyer held advanced knowledge of the axis of the Canadian attack, and that he moved his anti-tank defense to meet it. Whether that changed the outcome or merely raised the price remains the open question. Another analogy, presented only as an analogy. Modern information security draws a distinction between a breach and an exploitable breach, since data can be exfiltrated and still produce no material effect if the defender lacks the time, the resources, or the freedom of movement to act on it. The tractable plan constituted a genuine breach, and whether it constituted an exploitable breach depended entirely on whether the 12th SS Panzer Division still held enough armor and enough fuel to reposition meaningfully. By the 14th of August, 1944, that division was already grinding down toward the 10 tanks and 300 men Army Group B would report on the 22nd. The comparison is structural only. Since nobody in 1944 was running a threat model, but the question those men faced is the question modern defenders ask, which is whether the leak was actionable. The Canadian attack went in on the 14th of August, behind smoke, into an anti-tank defense that knew it was coming. And then, for the second time in 6 days, Allied heavy bombers hit Allied troops. A color caused the second friendly fire bombing incident of the Falaise Drive. Allied ground troops used yellow smoke and yellow identification panels to mark their own positions to friendly aircraft, while Royal Air Force Bomber Command crews used yellow target indicators to mark aiming points. On the ground, yellow meant we are here, do not bomb us. In the air, yellow meant bomb here. Bomber Command heavies bombed the yellow. Casualty figures for the 14th of August incident rank among the most contested numbers in this entire story, and the range runs wide enough that it needs laying out explicitly rather than summarizing. The journal Canadian Military History, reproducing the Royal Air Force report of the 25th of August, 1944, gives over 150 killed and 241 wounded. A compiled list of friendly fire incidents gives approximately 490 casualties including 112 dead, plus 265 vehicles, 30 guns, and 2 tanks destroyed. A third source gives 65 Canadians and 42 Poles killed, with 241 Canadians wounded. D-Day Overlord gives approximately 400 Canadian and Polish personnel put out of action. 3 definitional differences produce that spread. Whether the figure counts killed only or total casualties comes first. Whether Polish losses are folded into the Canadian total or reported separately comes second. Whether vehicle and equipment losses enter the accounting of the incident comes third. Investigation of the incident produced a report dated the 25th of August, 1944, and Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris was tied to that investigation. Another analogy, offered only as an analogy. Modern interface design and safety engineering recognize a category of failure called a semantic collision, where 2 systems assign opposite meanings to the same signal, and each system stays internally consistent, so neither one detects the error until the 2 systems interact. Color coding standards in aviation, in medicine, and in industrial control are written specifically to prevent it. The yellow smoke incident of the 14th of August, 1944, is a semantic collision in its purest form, with ground forces and air forces each using yellow correctly according to their own doctrine, in a way that made the 2 doctrines lethal to each other. The comparison holds structurally, and no safety standard existed in 1944 to catch it, which is arguably the point. 2 bombing incidents fell inside a single week. On the 8th of August the United States 8th Air Force killed approximately 65 and wounded approximately 250. On the 14th of August Royal Air Force Bomber Command produced figures ranging from 107 killed to over 150 killed, and up to 490 total casualties depending on the count used. Canadian and Polish soldiers were bombed twice by their own side inside a single week, on the same axis of advance, and then received orders to keep going toward Falaise. They kept going. Between the 16th and 18th of August, 1944, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division took Falaise. The town gave the pocket its name and it was defended to the end, with a detachment of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend among the last defenders, holding the École Supérieure de Jeunes Filles, a girls' school, in a final stand. Take a moment on the composition of that division, because it explains the character of the fighting on this axis. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was built around personnel drawn from the Hitler Youth, and on the 6th of June it had fielded 20,540 men. By the 22nd of August, Army Group B reported it at 10 tanks, 300 men, and no artillery. Everything in between happened in the ground between Caen and Falaise, and the largest share of it happened against Canadian and Polish formations. While that fighting ran its course, the German command structure came apart at the top. On the 17th of August, 1944, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Oberbefehlshaber West and Army Group B, lost his command and was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. Suspicion had fallen on von Kluge in the aftermath of the 20th of July plot against the German head of state, and Berlin had recalled him. On the 19th of August, 1944, between Paris and Metz, Gunther von Kluge took cyanide and killed himself. Those dates require a flag, because sources conflict. Von Kluge's relief is given variously as the 15th and the 17th of August, and his suicide as the 18th and the 19th. Most sources give the 17th of August for the relief and the 19th of August for the suicide, and those are the dates used here, with the conflict acknowledged rather than hidden. On the German side as well, SS-Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, commanding the 7th Army, was seriously wounded and evacuated on the back of a tank. That was the state of German command in the third week of August, 1944. The commander of Army Group B relieved and dead by his own hand. The commander of the 7th Army wounded and carried out on a tank deck. The 5th Panzer Army under SS-Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich and Panzer Group Eberbach under General Heinrich Eberbach trying to extract two armies through a corridor closing on both sides. Being specific about what sat inside the ring at this point is worthwhile, because the phrase an entire German army gets used loosely in most accounts, and the reality is more precise. The encircled force was Army Group B, meaning the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, the latter formerly designated Panzergruppe West, together with the ad hoc formation designated Panzer Group Eberbach. Divisions caught inside or fighting on the perimeter included the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the 21st Panzer Division, the 89th Infantry Division, the 85th Infantry Division, and the 116th Panzer Division. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, Michael Wittmann's unit, equipped with Tiger tanks, had been fighting on the Canadian Axis since Totelise opened. Outside the pocket, driving inward to break it open, sat the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen. Remnants of 14 to 15 divisions lay inside the pocket. That measures the scale of what the northern and southern jaws were closing on, meaning not one army but two, plus a panzer group, with a further SS Panzer Corps attacking from outside to cut them a way out. Falaise fell, and the Canadians had reached the town that named the battle, but the town was never the objective. The objective was the road east, and the road east ran through three villages, being Trun, Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, and Chambois. On the 18th of August, 1944, Canadian forces captured Trun. Trun sits at the northern end of a stretch of the River Dives Valley that became, in about 72 hours, one of the most concentrated killing grounds of the Western Front. The geography deserves stating precisely, because it explains both the scale of the German losses and the scale of the German escape. The Dives Valley between Magny and Moissy runs roughly 5 kilometers, and within that stretch lay crossings at Magny, at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, and at Moissy, with the river shallow enough to wade in places at Moissy. That 5-kilometer stretch formed the mouth of the pocket. Allied forces held the shoulders, with Canadian forces at Trun and pushing toward Saint-Lambert, Polish forces driving toward Chambois, and American forces coming up from the south. Holding the shoulders is not the same as blocking the ground, though, because the crossings remained physically open, covered by indirect fire from artillery and mortars rather than physically occupied. Thousands of German troops went through that gap under shell fire. Men fighting in the corridor gave it a name. The Corridor of Death, or in French, the Couloir de la Mort. At one ford in that corridor a German column was destroyed, and the account records that only a single horse survived. That detail rewards attention for a reason beyond the obvious one, and the reason is horses. In August 1944, in the most mechanized campaign the world had yet fought, the German army in Normandy still moved a large share of its transport and artillery by horse. Columns dying in the Dives Valley were not purely armored columns, but mixed columns of tanks, trucks, guns, carts, and draft animals, jammed onto roads under continuous artillery observation. 5 kilometers of river valley, 3 fords, an army trying to pour through in a week, and artillery observers on the high ground on both sides with the range already registered. That is what the Canadians and Poles fought to close, and it explains why the fighting at St. Lambert-sur-Dives and on Hill 262, two actions involving a few hundred Canadians and a few thousand Poles between them, mattered out of all proportion to the numbers engaged. Everything now converges on those two positions. At approximately 1800 hours on the 18th of August, 1944, a Canadian force set out for the village of St. Lambert-sur-Dives, which sat directly on the escape route running from Chambois to Trun. Major David Vivian Curry of the South Alberta Regiment, the 29th Canadian Armoured Reconnaissance Regiment, commanded it. That force was assembled ad hoc, drawing on C Squadron of the South Alberta Regiment, a company of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, and self-propelled anti-tank guns. Compiled figures give roughly 100 infantry, roughly 11 tanks, and 2 anti-tank guns, while the memorial at St. Lambert also records elements of the Lincoln and Welland Regiment and the 5th Anti-Tank Regiment. Roughly 100 infantry and 11 tanks, placed astride the escape corridor of two German armies. Curry's force held St. Lambert-sur-Dives from the 18th to the 21st of August, 1944. Results, as recorded in the Victoria Cross citation, ran as follows. 7 tanks destroyed. 12 88mm guns destroyed. 40 vehicles destroyed. 300 Germans killed, 500 wounded, and 2,100 captured. 2,100 prisoners taken by a force of roughly 100 infantry and 11 tanks. Major David Vivian Curry received the Victoria Cross for the action at St. Lambert-sur-Dives. It stands as the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian in the Normandy campaign, and it remains the only Victoria Cross ever awarded to a member of the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps. Publication of the citation came in the London Gazette, issue number 36812, dated the 27th of November, 1944, and that reference comes from Veterans Affairs Canada. Curry received the decoration at Buckingham Palace on the 30th of November, 1944. One Curry quotation circulates widely, describing the effect of Allied artillery falling close to his own position. Curry said that they were lucky, that they suffered no casualties from their own guns, but that it had a very devastating effect on the Germans. That quotation appears everywhere, and it appears here, with the note for the record that it should be confirmed against the original Canadian Broadcasting Corporation or Library and Archives Canada recording before anyone treats it as verbatim. What Curry's force achieved at St. Lambert-sur-Dives was not the destruction of the German 7th Army. It was the denial of the escape route from Chambois to Trun, one of the small number of usable exits from the pocket, held for 3 days by a battle group that should not have been able to hold it for 3 hours. On the 19th of August, 1944, on the road between Trun and Chambois, Lieutenant Donald I. Grant of the Canadian Army Film and Photo Unit took a photograph. Library and Archives Canada catalogues it as PA111565, and it shows Major David Curry, pistol in hand, accepting the surrender of German troops. Motion picture footage of the same moment was shot by a cameraman named Stollery, and it appears in Canadian Army Newsreel number 40. That photograph ranks among the most reproduced images in Canadian military history, and it arrives attached to a claim that needs careful handling. The claim you will hear repeatedly is that it is the only photograph ever taken of a Victoria Cross action in progress. What C.P. Stacey, the Canadian official historian who wrote the Victory Campaign, actually wrote as the caption was that it is as close as we are ever likely to come to a photograph of a man winning the Victoria Cross. Read those two statements against each other, because the difference between them is the entire discipline of history. Stacey's version makes a carefully hedged claim about likelihood, saying as close as we are ever likely to come, which concedes uncertainty and asserts nothing about every photograph ever taken in every war. The popular version converts that hedge into an absolute, calling it the only photograph of a Victoria Cross action in progress, which is a far stronger claim, unverifiable in principle, and not what the official historian wrote. This is a small example of a very large problem, and naming it directly is worthwhile because it recurs throughout the Falaise story. Lying is not the mechanism, since nobody propagating the stronger claim is inventing anything. Hedge erosion is the mechanism. A careful historian writes a qualified sentence, a popular account drops the qualifier because the qualifier reads as clumsy, and a later account cites the popular account. Within 3 citations the hedge has vanished and an absolute claim circulates with the authority of the original scholar's name still attached to it. You have already watched the same mechanism operate on the Whitman killing, where a disputed attribution hardened into a settled one, and you will watch it again shortly, on a far larger scale, applied to the casualty figures for the entire pocket. Stacy's version is the correct version of the photograph claim, and accuracy costs it nothing. As close as we are ever likely to come to a photograph of a man winning the Victoria Cross. That reads as extraordinary enough without upgrading it. The image itself remains what it always was, showing a Canadian major in a Norman village on the 19th of August, 1944, standing in the middle of the collapse of two German armies, taking the surrender of men from a force that outnumbered his own by a factor the citation would eventually put at 21-1 in prisoners alone. While Major David Curry's force held St. Lambert-sur-Dives, the other half of the closure was being fought by the 1st Polish Armored Division under Major General Stanislaw Maczek. The Polish division fought under 2nd Canadian Corps, under Lieutenant General Guy Simons, as part of 1st Canadian Army. Most accounts of Falaise skip past that command relationship in a clause, and it deserves better, because what the Poles did across the following 72 hours cannot be separated from the Canadian operation and was fought under Canadian Operational Command. On the morning of the 19th of August, 1944, after the Canadians took St. Lambert, the Poles attacked toward Chambois. The units involved were the 10th Dragoons under Major Władysław Gorzelski, and the 24th Lancers, and they entered the ruined town at approximately 19:30 on the 19th of August. There, in Chambois, Polish troops of the 1st Polish Armored Division met American troops of the 2nd Battalion, 359th Infantry Regiment, 90th Infantry Division, under Major Leonard Dull. That was the link-up, with the Northern Jaw and the Southern Jaw meeting in a wrecked Norman town at 7:30 in the evening on the 19th of August, 1944. Brigadier General William G. Weaver commanded the 90th Infantry Division, and Colonel Robert L. Bacon commanded the 359th Infantry Regiment. Most popular accounts of Falaise treat that handshake at Chambois as the moment the pocket closed. It was not. Here is the fact that reframes the entire final phase of the battle, and it is the single most important thing in this account. Even after the link-up at Chambois on the 19th of August, the roughly 5 kilometers of the Dives Valley between Magny and Moissy was not physically blocked. Crossings at Magny, at St. Lambert, and at Moissy remained open, covered by indirect fire rather than occupied by troops standing on the ground, which meant the pocket was reported closed on the 19th of August and was not actually sealed until the evening of the 21st. 2 days separated the two events, and across those 2 days German troops kept moving east through fords and crossings that were under fire but were not held. That 2-day gap between the symbolic closure and the physical closure is where a large share of the German escape happened. It also explains why the escape figures in the historiography range so wildly, because different historians measure against different closure dates, and the difference between the 19th and the 21st of August amounts to tens of thousands of men. The handshake at Chambois was real, and the seal was not. The men who had to make the seal real were the two Polish battle groups who had already pushed past Chambois onto a ridge to the northeast, a piece of ground the Poles had nicknamed the Miksuga. Northeast of Chambois, above the village of Coudhard, rises the feature known as Mont Ormel, which carried the designation Hill 262 on Allied maps, with a northern and a southern peak. Major General Stanislaw Maczek looked at the shape of the feature and thought it resembled a mace, which in Polish is a Miksuga. The name stuck, and the ridge has been the Miksuga ever since. On the night of the 19th of August, 1944, two Polish battle groups established themselves on the northern peak. The composition included the battle group under Major Władysław Gorzelski, comprising the 1st Armored Regiment, the 9th Infantry Battalion, and an anti-tank company, while the Podhalian Battalion, the Highland Battalion, led the assault onto the feature. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stefanovich commanded the 1st Armored Regiment. By the morning of the 20th of August the tactical situation read as follows. The Poles sat on high ground directly overlooking the German escape corridor, with artillery observation over the roads two German armies needed, so they could see everything and shell everything. They were also, by that point, entirely cut off. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced von Kluge 3 days earlier, organized attacks against the ridge from both sides simultaneously. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps attacked from outside the pocket, driving in from the east toward the trapped German armies, while formations inside the pocket attacked outward from the west. The Polish position on Hill 262 was struck from both directions at once, isolated, and a corridor was forced past it. For 3 days the Poles held that ridge without resupply. No ammunition arrived, no water, no medical supplies, and no evacuation of wounded. Throughout all of it, Polish artillery observers on Hill 262 kept directing fire onto the German columns retreating below them. One detail conveys the character of the fighting on that position better than any casualty figure. A single German Panther tank, firing from point 239 approximately 1,500 meters to the north, knocked out 5 Polish Shermans in as many minutes. 5 tanks, 5 minutes, 1 gun. The casualty figures form another case where the honest answer is a range rather than a number. Michael Reynolds and Evan McGilvray give Polish losses on Hill 262 as 351 killed and wounded, along with 11 tanks. Roman Jeremowicz gives 325 killed, 1,002 wounded, and 114 missing, amounting to approximately 20% of combat strength. Those two figures cannot be reconciled directly, and scope is the reason. The lower figure appears to describe losses on the Miksuga position specifically, while the higher figure appears to describe division-wide losses across the whole operation. Terry Kopp, quoting the division's own operational report, gives the 1st Polish Armored Division's total casualties for the entire operation to close the pocket as 1,441, including 466 killed. German losses on and around Hill 262 are estimated by McGilvray at approximately 500 dead and approximately 1,000 taken prisoner, most of them from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The 12th SS turns up again, and it is the same division that had held the Cannes to Falaise road against Totelys on the 8th of August, destroyed Worthington Force on the 9th, read the tractable plan on the 13th, and made the last stand in the girls' school at Falaise. By the 20th of August it was breaking itself against a Polish armored division on a hilltop, and on the 22nd it would be reported at 10 tanks and 300 men. On the 21st of August, 1944, the 4th Canadian Armored Division reached Hill 262, and the relieving unit was the Canadian Grenadier Guards. What the Canadians found on that ridge went into the war diary of the Canadian 4th Armored, and it is one of the few passages in this entire account that requires no commentary at all. The war diary records that the picture at 262 was the grimmest the regiment had so far come up against, that the Poles had had no supplies for 3 days, that they had several hundred wounded who had not been evacuated, that about 700 prisoners lay loosely guarded in a field, and that the Poles cried with joy when the Canadians arrived. 700 prisoners, held in a field, guarded by men who had run out of ammunition, water, and medical supplies 3 days earlier, with several hundred of their own wounded lying untreated among them. That was the northern jaw of the Falaise Pocket at the moment it finally closed. On the evening of the 21st of August, 1944, the pocket was sealed. Before the seal, though, on the 20th of August, the Germans made their most serious attempt to break it open from the outside, and the attempt succeeded well enough to matter. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps attacked westward from outside the ring, while Field Marshal Walter Model, who had held command for 3 days, coordinated attacks from both directions at once, with the 2nd SS Panzer Corps pressing in from the east and formations inside the pocket pressing out from the west, both converging on the same corridor. That was the attack that isolated the Polish position on Hill 262 and forced a passage past it. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen sat at the center of that effort, and the record credits them with helping a large number of German troops escape. That detail reframes the escape figures examined shortly, because the men who got out of the Falaise Pocket did not all get out through Allied inattention. A meaningful share got out because 2 SS Panzer divisions attacked from outside the encirclement on the 20th of August, forced a corridor open past a Polish division that had run out of ammunition 3 days earlier, and held it long enough for columns to pass through. That does not describe a failure of vigilance. That describes an opposed operation, contested, and partly successful. On the same day, the 21st of August, 1944, Major General George Kitching lost command of the 4th Canadian Armored Division. The relief came amid Lieutenant General Guy Simons's dissatisfaction with the division's pace of advance, and Kitching was not alone, since Simons dismissed several commanding officers at the end of August, 1944, a fact C.P. Stacey cited in the official history as evidence of Canadian command problems. Consider the position that puts a listener in. On the 21st of August, The 4th Canadian Armoured Division relieved a Polish division that had held an isolated hilltop for 3 days without supply, in an action that helped seal the encirclement of 2 German armies. On that same day, the commander of that Canadian division was fired for being too slow. Both things are true, and whether the second one was just is the question the rest of this account turns on, because the relief of George Kitching works as a miniature of the entire historiographical argument over Canadian performance at Falaise. Sealed on the 21st of August, the pocket held, and Army Group B's remnants completed their retreat across the Seine by the 30th of August, ending Operation Overlord. Then came the counting, and unusually for a battle of this scale, scientists did it. The British No. 2 Operational Research Section conducted a systematic survey of the ground inside the pocket, and it produced one of the most valuable documents to come out of the Normandy campaign, because it is not a claim by a commander or an estimate by an intelligence staff. It is a physical count of wreckage conducted on the ground by analysts whose job was accuracy. The No. 2 Operational Research Section survey, as published in After the Battle Issue 8, counted inside the pocket 187 tanks and self-propelled guns, 157 lightly armored vehicles, 1,778 lorries, 669 cars, and 252 artillery pieces. A competing figure circulates widely for the same or an overlapping area, giving 344 tanks and self-propelled guns, 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles, and 252 guns. Notice that the artillery figure, 252 guns, matches exactly in both, while the armor and vehicle counts do not. That is the signature of 2 surveys covering different sectors or different date ranges, and it is flagged here as needing reconciliation rather than being averaged into a false middle. Outside the pocket, the operational researchers counted 2 further areas. In the area designated the Shambles, near Vimoutiers, 2nd Tactical Air Force counted 5,644 German vehicles destroyed, damaged, or abandoned, including 358 tanks and self-propelled guns. In the area designated the Chase, the Operational Research Section counted 3,648 vehicles, breaking down as 150 tanks, 154 other armored vehicles, 3,178 soft-skinned vehicles, and 166 guns. Because the analysts concentrated on main roads, they estimated the true total in the Chase at 5,000 to 6,000 vehicles. Buried in those reports sits a finding that overturns the most popular visual of the entire battle. The operational research analysts found that few German armored fighting vehicles showed rocket damage, and that most of the soft-skinned vehicles destroyed had been destroyed by cannon and machine gun fire. Consider what that does to the received account. The standard image of Falaise features rocket-firing Typhoons destroying German tanks in the corridor, with the tank-busting fighter-bomber as the decisive weapon of the pocket. Physical survey of the wreckage does not support it, because the rockets were not what killed the armor. What killed the armor, according to the same evidence, was the loss of transporters and fuel. German tanks in the pocket were overwhelmingly abandoned rather than destroyed in combat, meaning immobilized, out of fuel, impossible to recover, and left behind by crews escaping on foot. The same evidentiary discipline produced the Whitman correction earlier. That propaganda claim about Michael Whitman falling to fighter bombers was contradicted by Royal Air Force logs and by his own unit, and the popular claim that Typhoons destroyed the armor in the Falaise Pocket is contradicted by the men who walked the ground and counted the holes. Aircraft mattered enormously at Falaise, and they mattered by destroying the transport, the fuel, and the movement, not by killing tanks with rockets. The difference between those 2 claims is the difference between a legend and a survey. Being clear about why the operational research section figures deserve the weight given here is worthwhile, and so is being clear about their limits. Their strength lies in method, because the analysts walked the ground, examined individual wrecks, and classified the damage by cause, covering cannon fire, machine gun fire, rocket, demolition, and abandonment. That is physical evidence gathered close to the event by people with no stake in the outcome of the argument, and that category of source almost never exists for battles of this period. Their limit lies in coverage, and the analysts stated it themselves. In the area designated the Chase they concentrated on main roads, and on that basis they estimated the true total at 5,000 to 6,000 vehicles against the 3,648 they had actually counted. Put plainly, the operational researchers openly reported that their own count was an undercount, and roughly by how much. That is the difference between a figure produced by a scientific survey and a figure produced by a headquarters, because one of them tells you its own error bar. That standard should govern every other number in this story, covering the casualty ranges, the prisoner totals, and above all the escape figures. The escape figure is the number the entire argument turns on, and no agreed answer exists. Carelessness among historians is not the reason. Instability in the question itself is the reason. Here is the full range, laid out with attribution, exactly as it exists in the literature. The synthesized consensus figure, drawn from multiple historians, gives 80,000 to 100,000 German troops encircled, and of those, 10,000 to 15,000 killed, 40,000 to 50,000 captured, and 20,000 to 50,000 escaped, with the remnants of 14 to 15 divisions inside the pocket. The Imperial War Museum states that around 50,000 Germans escaped the pocket while another 60,000 were either killed or taken prisoner inside it by the 22nd of August. At the low end of the escape estimate stands the German commander's own count, since General Heinrich Eberbach estimated that around 20,000 men, 25 tanks, and 50 pieces of mechanized artillery had escaped. At the high end, general accounts and the historian Rick Atkinson put the figure at more than 100,000. Atkinson adds a specific and damning breakdown, recording that the escapees included 4 of 5 corps commanders and 12 of 15 division commanders, and that British intelligence estimated 95% of the Germans who reached the Seine successfully crossed it. In the middle sits Omar Bradley's own admission from a general's life in 1983, giving up to 50,000 veteran Germans escaping as a result of the halt at Argentan. 20,000, 50,000, 100,000. Those are not small variations, and they differ by a factor of 5. The reason the spread exists deserves a direct answer, because understanding the reason carries more value than picking a number. First, the base population is defined differently, since some historians count the force encircled inside the pocket while others count German strength across the whole Normandy front at the relevant date. Second, the closure date is defined differently, and as already established, the pocket was reported closed on the 19th of August at Chambois and was not physically sealed until the evening of the 21st, so a historian measuring escapes up to the 19th produces a much lower figure than one measuring up to the 21st, and one measuring the full retreat to the Seine on the 30th produces a higher figure still. Third, Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations are sometimes counted together and sometimes separately. Fourth, wounded evacuated before the encirclement closed are sometimes counted as escapees and sometimes excluded entirely. Fifth, and most fundamentally, accurately counting a disintegrating army is not actually possible, because Northwest roll call took place, units ceased to exist as units, and men walked east individually and in small groups over a period of days across 5 kilometers of river valley. Warfare History Network states the underlying problem bluntly, observing that everyone who gives an estimate is trying to prove a point. Another analogy, presented only as an analogy. Modern financial and statistical reporting relies on a discipline called measurement definition, which requires that any published figure specify its population, its period, and its inclusion criteria before the figure means anything at all. Two organizations reporting the same metric with different definitions will produce numbers differing by multiples while both remain technically correct, and unemployment figures, hospital waiting lists, and corporate emissions accounting all run into it. The Falaise escape figures belong to the same category of problem, applied to a battlefield. The comparison holds structurally only, and it explains why a listener can encounter 20,000 in one book and 100,000 in another and conclude that historians are unreliable, when both figures may be defensible under their stated definitions, and the real failure is that the definitions usually go unstated. The takeaway runs like this. Somewhere in the order of 80,000 to 100,000 Germans were caught. Remnants of 14 to 15 divisions were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. Tens of thousands went into captivity and 10 to 15,000 were killed. And a large number, with a defensible range of 20,000 to 50,000 and higher estimates in circulation, got out, largely through a 5-kilometer stretch of the Dives Valley in the 2 days between the handshake at Chambois and the physical seal on the 21st. The men who got out included most of the senior commanders, who would rebuild their formations and fight again. Serious historians have made a specific accusation in print for 60 years, holding that the northern jaw of the Falaise encirclement moved too slowly, that 2nd Canadian Corps under Guy Simons took too long to cover the ground from Caen to Falaise, and that the delay explains why tens of thousands of Germans escaped. The case is not frivolous, and here it is at its strongest. The critical thesis runs through C.P. Stacey's official history and reaches its most forceful expression in John A. English's book, The Canadian Army and the Normandy Campaign, subtitled A Study of Failure in High Command, published by Praeger in 1991. That title states the argument on its own. English emphasizes failures in high command, inadequate pre-invasion training, and overcomplex operational plans, which critics of Symonds have characterized as war by timetable, meaning elaborate schemes of maneuver that depended on everything happening on schedule and collapsed when anything did not. Stacey himself wrote a sentence that has hung over Canadian military historiography ever since, holding that it cannot be said that it was by tactical superiority that we won the Battle of Normandy. That is the official historian of the Canadian Army, writing in the Victory campaign, declining to claim tactical superiority for the army whose history he was writing. Corroborating evidence exists for the critical case, and this account has already presented it. Worthington Force went astray by 6.5 kilometers and was destroyed on the wrong hill. The tractable plan was captured and reached Courtmire before the attack went in. Major General George Kitching lost command of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division on the 21st of August, and several commanding officers were dismissed at the end of August, a fact Stacey cited specifically as evidence of command problems. Now the counter case, which is equally serious. Terry Kopp develops the revisionist position most fully in Fields of Fire, subtitled The Canadians in Normandy, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2003, and Kopp explicitly challenges and refutes the conventional view that the Canadian contribution in Normandy was a failure. Kopp's argument rests on what the Canadians actually faced. 2nd Canadian Corps attacked down the Cannes-to-Falaise corridor against the strongest remaining German armor on the Western Front, meaning the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend backed by 88mm anti-tank screens, on ground that favored the defender. Kopp argues the Canadians functioned as a flexible and effective army, and he takes direct aim at Stacey's line about tactical superiority. Consider the supporting evidence for Kopp's position that this account has already established. The 12th SS Panzer Division went from 20,540 men and 229 tanks on the 6th of June to 10 tanks and 300 men on the 22nd of August, and that destruction happened predominantly on the axis the Canadians were attacking. An army that is not tactically effective does not do that to a Waffen-SS Panzer Division. Symonds's supposed overcomplexity also produced the Kangaroo Armored Personnel Carrier, a genuine tactical innovation built in 6 days. Those vehicles were no one-off expedient either. Because of the 76 Priest Kangaroos, 61 still counted as battle-worthy at the end of Operation Tractable, with 15 recoverable casualties that were mostly mechanical rather than combat losses. That survival rate does not describe an improvisation that failed. The concept was then institutionalized, since the 1st Canadian Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, the Kangaroo Squadron, stood up as a permanent unit around the 20th to 28th of August, 1944, immediately after the pocket closed. A further piece of evidence cuts both ways, and it is usually cited only on the critical side. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division under Major General George Kitching fought for the high ground designated .195 and .175, with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada prominent in that fighting. .195 was the objective Worthington Force never reached on the 9th of August, and it fell the following day, with the record indicating that the German concentration against the isolated battle group on .140 contributed directly to the capture. So the same division that lost a battle group to a navigation error also took the objective the following day, partly because of the losses it had just suffered. Whether that reads as failure or as a costly, adaptive, functioning formation depends entirely on which historian's framework you apply, and that is precisely Terry Kopp's point about how the Canadian record in Normandy has been read. This is not a dead debate either. Donald E. Graves defended English and Stacey against Kopp in the pages of Canadian military history, and the exchange stands as a documented, live scholarly dispute. Other named positions sit between the two poles, including Roman Jeremoix, whose focus falls on armored doctrine and tank tactics, and Mark Milner, who emphasizes the learning curve, arguing that formations improve through contact and that judging a 3-week-old army by the standard of a veteran one is a category error. The honest answer is that the question, as usually asked, is malformed. Accusing the Canadians of being slow depends on an assumption that has never been established, which is that a faster Canadian advance would have closed the gap. On the 13th of August, 1944, the Southern Jaw stopped at Argenton on an order whose origin remains disputed between Bradley and Montgomery, and whose author later conceded in print that it let up to 50,000 Germans out. A trap has two jaws, one of them was halted by command decision, and assigning the escape exclusively to the pace of the other one is not analysis. It is selection. Above the argument about Canadian pace sits a larger argument about the battle itself, and two theses exist in the literature, both held by serious historians, and close to irreconcilable. The first thesis holds that Falaise was an incomplete victory, and arguably a failure, and its advocates include Max Hastings, Carlo d'Este, and Richard Roemer. That case foregrounds the escapees, arguing that if 20,000 to 50,000 or more German troops got out, including on Atkinson's account 4 of 5 corps commanders and 12 of 15 division commanders, then the Allies failed to achieve an annihilation that lay within reach. Those cadres were rebuilt, and Bradley's own memoir concedes they fought again in the Ardennes. A battle of encirclement that lets the command structure escape has not destroyed an army, it has damaged one. The second thesis holds that Falaise was a decisive victory, and that case foregrounds what was actually destroyed. Remnants of 14 to 15 divisions were caught, most of Army Group B west of the Seine was destroyed, 40,000 to 50,000 men were captured, and 10 to 15,000 were killed. The physical count by the operational research sections runs to hundreds of tanks and self-propelled guns and thousands of vehicles across the pocket, the shambles, and the chase. The strategic consequence arrived immediately, with the road to Paris opening, the Germans driven back across the Seine by the 30th of August, and Operation Overlord ending in Allied success. Both theses use the same evidence and weight it differently. The framing the sources actually support runs like this. Falaise was a catastrophic German defeat that was nonetheless less complete than it could have been. Both halves of that sentence carry load, and removing either one produces a distortion. One specific quotation gets deployed in this argument, and it needs its own correction. General Dwight Eisenhower described the battlefield in his memoir Crusade in Europe, published by Doubleday in 1948. Eisenhower wrote that the battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas, with killing fields in quotation marks in the original. He wrote that 48 hours after the closing of the gap he was conducted through it on foot, to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. And he wrote that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. 2 points of provenance matter here, because this quotation gets misused constantly. First, the source is the 1948 memoir, not a speech, and not a wartime dispatch or letter, since Eisenhower wrote it 4 years after the fact in a book. Second, the wording. A common misquote reverses the word order to scenes that could only be described by Dante, and drops the quotation marks around killing fields, while the version given above is the correct one. The timing places Eisenhower's tour at approximately the 24th of August, 1944, 48 hours after the closure of the 21st. A corresponding description survives from inside the pocket, and it requires a warning before use. Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, wrote in his memoir Grenadiers that, concentrated in such a confined space, they offered unique targets for enemy air power. That serves as a useful description of the German experience, and Kurt Meyer is not a neutral witness, and this account will not present him as one. Meyer's memoir is self-exculpatory and denies war crimes his division committed. In December 1945, a Canadian court-martial at Oret convicted Kurt Meyer for the Ardennes Abbey massacre of Canadian prisoners of war. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was paroled after 9 years. Meyer's account is evidence of what the pocket felt like from inside. It is not evidence of anything else, and the men giving it had murdered Canadian prisoners. 80 years on, the physical record of the Falaise Pocket is still being read, and in some cases still being corrected. On Hill 262, above Coudhard, stands the Memorial de Montormel, commemorating the stand of the 1st Polish Armored Division on the Mixuga. At St. Lambert-sur-Dives there is a memorial to Major David V. Curry, which commemorates the South Alberta Regiment, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada, the Lincoln and Welland Regiment, and the 5th Anti-Tank Regiment. At Lockham German War Cemetery, an information center has operated since the mid-1990s. Lockham is also where the Whitman story ends, with one more disputed detail. The crew of Tiger 007 were buried in an unmarked roadside grave beside the N158. Discovery of the remains came on the 25th of March, 1983, following information from the mayor of Sinthos, Monsieur Sanson, and identification was made through dental records and through the identity disc of the driver, Heinrich Reimers. The remains were reinterred at La Cam. Sources conflict on whether Michael Whitman now lies in an individual marked grave or in the cemetery's central mass grave, the Kameradengrab, and that question is flagged here as unresolved. A commonly cited reinterment date of 1987 is also not corroborated by the sources consulted, which give a 1983 discovery and a reinterment shortly afterward. Scholarship on the battle also remains active, and it has produced at least one genuine reconstruction of an event that was poorly understood for decades. Michael Bechtold, working with the Laurier Center for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, used aerial reconnaissance photographs taken on the 9th of August, 1944, to reconstruct the route and destruction of Worthington Force, and the resulting study, Lost in Normandy, subtitled The Odyssey of Worthington Force, appeared in Canadian Military History. Think about what that involved. Photographs taken from an aircraft on the day of the action, held in an archive, read decades later against the ground, to establish where a battle group actually went when it believed it was going somewhere else. The men on Point 140 did not know where they were, and it took aerial photographs and modern analysis to establish it definitively. The journal Canadian Military History remains the active hub for this work, and it has reproduced the Royal Air Force report of the 25th of August, 1944, into the tractable short bombing incident, meaning the investigation into the yellow smoke and the yellow target indicators. A final analogy, offered only as an analogy. Modern accident investigation in aviation, in rail, and in industrial safety rests on the principle that physical evidence and recorded data outrank the testimony of the participants, because participants sit inside the event and cannot see its shape. The operational research surveys of the Falaise Pocket, the aerial photographs that located Worthington Force, and the Royal Air Force report of the 25th of August all function that way, and every one of them corrected a story the participants themselves had told wrong. The parallel holds structurally only, and it explains why the version of Falaise available to us now is more accurate than the version available to the men who fought it, and why claims that sound authoritative because a veteran said them are not automatically the strongest evidence available. Between the 12th and 21st of August, 1944, the 1st Canadian Army drove south from Caen into the ground around Falaise and helped seal between 80,000 and 100,000 German soldiers inside a pocket they could not break out of intact. That was the claim this account opened with, and everything since has been the evidence for it and the arguments about it. Here is what the Canadians did. They broke through the Caen to Falaise defensive belt at night on the 7th and 8th of August, riding in armored personnel carriers built in 6 days by 250 men drawn from 14 workshops. They absorbed 2 friendly fire bombardments from their own air forces inside a single week. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division took Falaise between the 16th and 18th of August, and Canadian forces took Trun on the 18th. Major David Vivian Curry held St. Lambert-sur-Dives from the 18th to the 21st with roughly 100 infantry and 11 tanks, taking 2,100 prisoners. And on the 21st of August they relieved a Polish armored division that had held Hill 262 for 3 days without ammunition, water, or medical supplies, finding 700 German prisoners loosely guarded in a field by men who had nothing left to guard them with. Here is what it cost. 5,679 Canadian casualties in the closing battle. Across the whole Normandy campaign, nearly 20,000 Canadian casualties, including 5,021 killed. And for the 1st Polish Armored Division fighting under Canadian command, 1,441 casualties including 466 killed, according to the division's own operational report as quoted by Terry Kopp. Here is what remains argued. Whether the northern jaw moved too slowly, whether the halt order at Argenton on the 13th of August came from Bradley or from Montgomery, how many Germans actually escaped, and whether Falaise belongs on the record as a decisive victory or an incomplete one. Here is what the record will not support. That Typhoon rockets destroyed the German armor in the pocket, since the operational research surveys found few armored vehicles with rocket damage and attributed the abandonment to lost transporters and fuel. That Michael Wittmann was killed by fighter bombers, since that was a Nazi propaganda claim contradicted by Royal Air Force logs and by his own unit, and the actual killing shot remains disputed between the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry and the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment. That the Curry photograph is the only image of a Victoria Cross action in progress, since C.P. Stacey wrote only that it is as close as we are ever likely to come, and that the pocket closed at Chambois on the 19th of August, since the Dives Valley crossings at Magny, St. Lambert, and Moissy stayed open under indirect fire until the evening of the 21st. The last word on what that ground looked like belongs to the Supreme Allied Commander, who walked it on foot approximately 48 hours after the closure and wrote about it 4 years later in Crusade in Europe. Eisenhower called the battlefield at Falaise unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas, said he encountered scenes that could be described only by Dante, and recorded that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. 80,000 to 100,000 men were caught in that pocket. 10 to 15,000 of them died there. 40 to 50,000 went into captivity. 14 to 15 divisions ceased to exist as fighting formations. The northern jaw was held closed by a Canadian army activated on the 23rd of July, by a Polish division fighting under Canadian command from a hilltop it had nicknamed the Mixuga, and by roughly 100 infantrymen and 11 tanks in a village called St. Lambert-sur-Dives. So the question worth leaving with is not whether the gap should have closed faster. It is this. A trap has two jaws, and one of them was ordered to stop at Argentan on the 13th of August, 1944, by an order whose author is still disputed. For 80 years, a great deal of the escape from the Falaise Pocket has been attributed instead to the jaw that never stopped moving.